The tension inside the high-security hangar of Langford Aerospace was thick enough to suffocate. The sleek, matte black fuselage of the experimental X700 jet sitting frozen under the harsh halogen lights, while millions of dollars in defense contracts ticked away with every passing second. General Vance stepped forward, his face flushed with rage as he pointed a rigid finger at the quiet man in grease-stained overalls, his voice booming across the concrete hangar floor that no civilian could touch this jet, let alone a local line mechanic who belonged in a prop plane repair shed. In that exact instant, a polished senior engineer stepped back in panic, knocking a heavy steel torque wrench off the presentation table, sending it crashing onto the pristine floor where it shattered a glass pressure gauge into 1,000 glittering shards. Caleb Thornton didn't blink, his face remaining perfectly calm as he slowly unzipped his worn canvas backpack and pulled out a weathered, faded military folder, sliding it across the metal table to reveal the classified seals that made the entire room go dead silent. To find out how a quiet, overlooked single father holding a wrench turned out to be the only man alive who could save a $100 million defense contract, stay until the very end. Before we travel back to see how this incredible confrontation began, take a moment to leave a comment if these stories of quiet, hard-working heroes who carry immense secret burdens speak to your heart, because so many of you watching have lived these exact moments of being overlooked. It raises a powerful question that divides many families today, namely whether a brilliant professional who experiences a devastating tragedy is practicing noble silent endurance by taking a low-status job to protect his child's peace, or if he should have stood up and fought to maintain his high-profile legacy at all costs. 4 years earlier, none of this corporate chaos or military pressure existed at the quiet regional airfield in the sleepy town of Oak Ridge. Caleb Thornton had spent those years working as a standard low-status line mechanic, a man who spoke only when spoken to, moving with a deliberate rhythmic precision that the younger, tech-obsessed mechanics often mistook for slow, old-fashioned laziness. In reality, Caleb was a man operating under the heavy weight of a private, suffocating grief, having lost his wife Sarah to a sudden illness 4 years ago, a devastating loss that left him as the sole caretaker of their beautiful 4-year-old daughter, Harper, to ensure he could pack her school lunches every morning, walk her to the yellow bus stop at the corner of the dirt road, and be sitting across from her at the kitchen table every single evening at exactly 5 o'clock. Caleb had walked away from a world of high-stakes technology, trading a brilliant trajectory for the quiet safety of an hourly maintenance position where nobody asked about his past. He lived in a modest, sun-faded farmhouse 3 miles from the runway, his life stripped down to the absolute essentials of fatherhood and survival. His uniform consisting of the same faded blue overalls and a canvas backpack that went everywhere with him, holding his lunch and a few old tools. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the country, Victoria Langford was living a life measured in quarterly growth margins, frantic board meetings, and relentless, agonizing pressure. As the billionaire CEO of Langford Aerospace, she had staked the entire future of her family's multi-generational legacy on the X700 Vanguard, an experimental, high-altitude reconnaissance jet designed to revolutionize military aviation with its advanced fly-by-wire redundancy loops. The project had swallowed over $800 million in development costs, and with the final Department of Defense demonstration looming, Victoria needed a secure, remote location free from corporate espionage to conduct the final high-speed ground taxi and avionics validation tests. Oak Ridge Airfield, with its long, underutilized runway and secluded rural surroundings, was chosen as the temporary staging ground, bringing a massive convoy of high-tech mobile command trailers, security guards, and elite corporate engineers into Caleb's quiet world. Leading her engineering team was Julian Croft, a polished, impeccably tailored chief systems engineer whose resume boasted Ivy League credentials and who operated with the supreme, blinding confidence of a man who had never gotten his hands dirty on an actual hangar floor. When the massive transport trailers rolled onto the airfield, unloading the sleek, predatory shape of the X700, the local mechanics watched from behind the chain-link fence in absolute awe, but Caleb merely glanced up from the hydraulic pump of an old Piper Cherokee, noticing a subtle, irregular vibration in the jet's auxiliary cooling intake before it even touched the hangar floor. a detail he kept entirely to himself as he returned to his work. Victoria Langford paced the length of the temporary command center, her heels clicking sharply against the metal flooring as she reviewed the upcoming schedule, knowing that if the jet failed to perform in front of the Pentagon delegation, her company would face immediate financial ruin. Julian Croft stood beside her, adjusting his gold watch and reassuring her with smooth corporate language, confidently stating that every line of code in the advanced flight control system had been verified by his elite team of credentialed newcomers. He dismissed the rural airfield as a mere pit stop, openly mocking the local maintenance staff as simple grease monkeys who were only qualified to patch up outdated crop dusters. Caleb continued his quiet routine, pushing a heavy cart of aviation oil past the secure hangar doors, his eyes lingering for just a fraction of a second on the complex layout of the X700's primary avionics bay, recognizing the core architecture with a profound, hidden familiarity that no one in the room could have ever guessed. He watched as the brilliant corporate engineers hooked up their multi-million-dollar diagnostic laptops, their faces frowning at the screen as they struggled to calibrate the primary data bus, entirely unaware that the quiet man sweeping the floor nearby possessed a deep, fundamental understanding of the very systems they were trying to force into compliance. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on that first evening, casting long amber shadows across the tarmac, Caleb walked out to the parking lot to drive his rusted pickup truck home, his thoughts focused entirely on making dinner for Harper and listening to her talk about her second-grade teacher. He knew that the corporate storm brewing in the main hangar would eventually collide with his quiet life. But for the sake of his daughter's stability and the peace he had fought so hard to build after his wife's passing, he resolved to remain invisible, a nameless ghost in a blue uniform who simply fixed what he was told to fix. 2 weeks would pass before the first major crack in the brilliant facade of Langford Aerospace would force Caleb to choose between his carefully guarded anonymity and the safety of the people around him. The damp autumn air hung heavily over the Oak Ridge airfield on a Tuesday morning when the entire project reached its first catastrophic breaking point, a moment that would expose the dangerous gap between theoretical credentials and real-world competence. The X700 Vanguard had been wheeled out onto the main taxiway for a high-speed ground run, its twin turbofan engines whining to life with a deafening, metallic scream that shook the windows of the small administrative building where the local mechanics were drinking their coffee. Victoria Langford stood on the observation deck, her fingers gripping the cold iron railing as she watched the jet accelerate down the runway. But just as the aircraft reached 80 knots, the sleek control surfaces on the tail began to flutter violently, throwing the entire digital flight control system into an uncommanded pitch axis reset. Inside the command trailer, red warning lights flashed across the diagnostic monitors, and the main primary flight display screens went completely dark, bricking the multi-million-dollar prototype in front of the entire assembly of anxious executives. Julian Croft frantically tapped at his ruggedized laptop, his face pale and sweating through his custom-tailored shirt as he tried to force a software override. But the system remained utterly unresponsive, frozen in a lethal digital loop that threatened to overheat the delicate avionics core. Caleb Thornton was standing less than 50 feet away, holding a simple hydraulic pressure gauge as he finished adjusting the landing gear on a local flight school's Cessna, his ears tuning into the irregular, high-pitched whine of the jet's auxiliary power unit. He closed his eyes for a brief second, calculating the exact frequency of the error, knowing immediately that this wasn't a simple software glitch, but rather a physical failure of the physical hardware integration. Moving with his characteristic quiet composure, Caleb walked into the high-security hangar, where Julian and Victoria were surrounded by a dozen panicked engineers, all of them shouting contradicting technical buzzwords about server protocols and sensor boards. Caleb stepped toward the edge of the open avionics bay, his voice calm, clear, and quiet, as he pointed to a thick bundle of shielded wiring near the primary manifold, noting that the system was experiencing a fundamental impedance mismatch in the fiber optic fly-by-wire redundancy loop because the main data bus was routed too close to the high-temperature engine, bleed airlines. Julian Croft spun around, his face contorting with a mixture of embarrassment and intense corporate arrogance as he looked at Caleb's grease-stained overalls and the worn canvas backpack resting near his feet. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh, asking the entire room if they were seriously going to listen to a local, uneducated line mechanic who spent his days fixing lawnmower engines and tightening bolts on 40-year-old prop planes. Julian corporate speaked his way through a vicious verbal assault, telling Caleb that the systems inside the X700 were protected by federal security clearances and required a level of advanced mathematics that a high school graduate wouldn't even begin to comprehend, demanding he take his rags and his ignorance back to the wash rack. Victoria Langford, her chest tightening under the immense pressure of the impending military deadline, turned her cold, piercing eyes toward Caleb, her voice filled with a dismissive, stressed authority as she told him that her engineers held doctorates from the top institutions in the country and did not require the unverified opinions of the local airport staff. She ordered Caleb to step away from the aircraft immediately and told the airfield manager that if the local mechanic entered the secure perimeter again, her company would pull its entire multi-million-dollar leasing contract from the facility. Caleb didn't argue, nor did he raise his voice or show a single spark of anger. He simply looked at Victoria with a profound, quiet sadness, realizing that her blind trust in credentials was blinding her to the very truth that could save her company from disaster. He quietly picked up his pressure gauge, zipped his worn canvas backpack, and walked out of the hangar into the cool morning air, leaving the elite corporate team to continue their futile troubleshooting. It is in moments like these that we see a profound division in our society, where the older generation experience and raw, skilled worker competence of those who truly understand how machines work are completely underestimated by credentialed newcomers who rely entirely on formal training and digital screens. The forced exit was absolute, and by noon, Caleb had been reassigned to a remote maintenance shed on the far eastern edge of the airfield, entirely isolated from the project that was rapidly falling apart under Julian Croft's panicked leadership. Victoria watched the quiet mechanic walk away, feeling a sudden, inexplicable pang of guilt in the silence of her own mind, but she quickly pushed it aside as Julian assured her that a complete replacement of the primary sensor board would fix the issue before the general's arrival the following morning. Caleb spent the rest of his shift quietly cleaning fuel injectors, his mind completely detached from the corporate drama as he looked at his watch, eager for 5 o'clock to arrive so he could pick up Harper from her after-school program. He knew the hidden flaw in the jet remained active, and he knew that when the engines reached full thermal capacity, the data corruption would happen again. But he had a daughter to protect, a quiet life to maintain, and he had learned long ago that some people have to face the consequences of their own arrogance before they can ever open their eyes to the truth. When the whistle blew at the end of the day, Caleb drove home in his old truck, listening to Harper talk about her drawings, completely leaving the world of aviation elite behind him as he cooked her favorite dinner and tucked her into bed under the quiet roof of their farmhouse. If you've ever felt unseen, dismissed, or completely underestimated by someone who looked down on your job or your appearance while you held the true answers all along, please share your story in the comments below, because your quiet resilience deserves to be recognized. Exactly 24 hours later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything neither of them had said out loud yet, bringing the multi-billion-dollar empire of Langford Aerospace to its absolute knees. The morning of the critical defense demonstration arrived with a biting, ice-cold wind that swept across the Oak Ridge runway, bringing with it 3 black government SUVs, carrying General Vance and his senior staff from the Pentagon Procurement Division. Victoria Langford stood inside the mobile command center, her hands trembling slightly as she poured a cup of black coffee, her eyes fixed on the financial spreadsheets that indicated her company would face immediate corporate liquidation if the general refused to sign the initial production contract today. Julian Croft walked around the room with an air of performative confidence, assuring the military delegation that his team had spent the entire night replacing the primary sensor boards and that the X700 Vanguard was now operating at absolute peak efficiency. The jet was wheeled out onto the main apron, its dark, aerodynamic frame glistening under the gray sky, and General Vance took his seat in the viewing gallery, his expression unreadable and stern as he demanded a flawless demonstration of the aircraft's emergency autonomous return system. The twin engines roared to life once more, and for the first 10 minutes of the ground taxi routine, everything appeared to be functioning perfectly, causing Julian to smile broadly and cast a smug glance toward the eastern maintenance sheds where Caleb was hidden away. But as the aircraft reached the midpoint of the runway and the engine temperature surged to full operational capacity, the thermal radiation breached the inadequate shielding near the primary data bus, exactly as Caleb had predicted, causing the fiber optic lines to warp and distort the navigation data. In an instant, the primary flight control computers suffered a catastrophic buffer overflow, locking the massive tail elevators at a lethal 12-degree deflection and completely freezing the cockpit digital interfaces, leaving the jet completely unresponsive on the active runway, while the engines continued to cycle at high idle. Julian Croft's smile shattered as he slammed his hands onto the diagnostic terminal, his face turning an ash-gray color as his software patches failed one after another, leaving him completely exposed as a fraud who had no understanding of the core system architecture. General Vance stood up from his chair, his voice cold as ice as he looked at Victoria, stating that he was giving her exactly 1 hour to clear the system failure and prove the aircraft was safe, or he would cancel the contract on the spot and blackball her company from federal bidding for the next 10 years. Victoria felt the entire world crumbling around her, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at her panicked engineering team, realizing with absolute clarity that none of them had any idea how to fix the deep structural crisis. She turned to her sharp young systems analyst, Chloe, a quiet young woman who had been quietly tracking the system logs from the back of the room, and demanded to know if there was anyone in the entire history of the company who had ever successfully mapped this specific redundancy loop. Chloe's fingers flew across her keyboard, digging deep into the archived, declassified military databases from 8 years ago, until she pulled up a dusty, restricted white paper detailing the exact core code of the Air Force's experimental fly-by-wire stability programs. The author's name printed on the official cover sheet was Dr. Caleb Thornton, the former legendary chief of advanced avionics for the Air Force Special Projects Division, a man who had mysteriously vanished from the defense industry years ago after the tragic death of his wife. Chloe gasped as she looked at the digital photograph attached to the personnel file, turning the screen toward Victoria to reveal that the legendary engineer who had designed the foundational systems of modern military aviation was the exact same local mechanic they had publicly humiliated and banished to the wash rack the day before. Victoria stood frozen as the realization hit her like a physical blow, her face burning with deep shame and regret as she remembered the arrogant words she had used to dismiss the most brilliant mind in the industry. Without saying a single word to Julian, Victoria grabbed her coat and practically ran out of the command center, sprinting across the windy tarmac toward the remote, weathered maintenance shed on the far edge of the airfield. She threw open the heavy wooden door, her breathing ragged as she stepped inside, finding Caleb sitting quietly at a small metal desk, patiently helping his 8-year-old daughter Harper with her third-grade multiplication flashcards. Victoria stopped in her tracks, the stark contrast between her high-pressure corporate panic and Caleb's peaceful, devoted fatherhood, forcing her to realize how completely she had misjudged this man's true character. She approached the desk, her voice shaking with genuine humility as she confessed that she knew exactly who he was now, offering him a blank corporate check, an immediate executive title, and a public apology if he would come back to the main hangar and save her company before the hour expired. Caleb didn't look at the check. He didn't even look surprised that his secret had been uncovered, instead turning his calm eyes to Harper and gently telling her to go play with her blocks in the back room for just a moment. He stood up, towering over Victoria with a quiet, unyielding dignity, and calmly stated that he had left that high-stakes world behind to protect his daughter's peace, and that he had absolutely no interest in her corporate wealth or her fancy titles. He stated his real conditions with a firm, absolute clarity, demanding that if he fixed the aircraft, Victoria must guarantee complete operational autonomy for the local maintenance crew, protect their jobs from corporate downsizing, and formally acknowledge the truth about who actually kept her aircraft flying. Before Victoria could even agree to his terms, a loud, terrifying klaxon siren began to blare across the entire airfield, its mechanical wail echoing through the walls of the maintenance shed. Chloe's voice cracked over Victoria's handheld radio, screaming that Julian Croft had attempted to force a manual hardware override on the jet, causing the auxiliary power unit to overheat rapidly and initiating a dangerous thermal runaway that threatened to ignite the central fuel bladder within 35 minutes. 8 minutes would pass before the true extent of that technical nightmare would force Caleb to step back into the light he had spent years trying to escape. The high-security hangar was a scene of absolute, unmitigated chaos when Caleb walked through the double doors, his worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder as he moved with a calm, unhurried pace that stood in stark contrast to the absolute panic consuming the corporate engineering staff. Julian Croft was screaming orders at two technicians who were desperately trying to spray cooling foam onto the base of the auxiliary power unit, while red digital warning screens across the hangar walls flashed a countdown indicating that the internal core temperature had reached a critical 400 degrees. Julian spun around as he saw Caleb approach, his face twisted with a mixture of terror and desperate corporate malice as he stepped forward to block the path, shouting that a low-status civilian mechanic had no right to be within 20 feet of a classified military prototype and threatening to have him arrested by base security. General Vance stepped forward from the viewing platform, his military uniform immaculate, but his face tight with authority, his voice booming across the concrete as he declared that no civilian could touch this jet, especially not an ordinary line worker, when national security systems were actively failing. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or engage in a useless shouting match with the arrogant men standing before him, instead reaching into his canvas backpack with a slow, deliberate movement. He pulled out the weathered, faded military folder he had carried for years, opening it on the metal presentation table to reveal his active, highest-level Department of Defense civilian engineering credentials, alongside 3 personal commendations signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for his work on the original fly-by-wire safety systems. The visual shock of the gold seals and the classified clearance stamps hit the room like a physical impact, causing General Vance's eyes to widen in absolute recognition as he looked from the documents to the quiet father standing before him, realizing he was looking at the literal pioneer of modern military avionics. The general's voice caught in his throat as he stepped back, his authority instantly melting into profound respect, and he ordered his guards to step aside, telling Caleb that the aircraft was entirely his to command. Caleb wasted no more time on words, ignoring the stunned, silent stares of Julian Croft and the remaining engineers as he moved toward the open avionics bay of the smoking X700 with absolute, unmatched competence. He didn't connect a diagnostic laptop or wait for a digital screen to boot up. Instead, he relied on his deep, intuitive understanding of the physical machine, reaching deep into the primary console to manipulate the manual pneumatic bleed valves with his bare, grease-stained hands. He climbed up into the cockpit, his fingers moving across the physical breaker switches with a rapid, rhythmic precision, pulling down the secondary circuit panel behind the pilot's seat to locate the hidden hardware emergency bypass loop that he had personally invented a decade earlier. He took a small piece of copper jumper wire from his pocket, manually grounding the primary data bus to clear the buffer overflow, bypassing Julian's convoluted software patches entirely and allowing the core system to reset its thermal boundaries. Within 4 minutes of Caleb stepping onto the wing, the high-pitched, terrifying whine of the overheating auxiliary power unit began to drop in pitch, settling into a stable, quiet hum as the red warning screens across the hangar abruptly flashed to a calm, solid green. The main digital glass cockpit displays instantly illuminated, showing a complete, flawless system restoration with zero data corruption, the flight control surfaces automatically returning to their neutral, perfect alignment. Victoria Langford watched from the floor, her heart pounding against her ribs as she witnessed a level of engineering genius she had never seen in any boardroom or university lecture, her eyes filling with a mixture of profound awe and deep, burning guilt for how she had treated him. Just then, Chloe stepped forward holding a printed data log from the central server, her voice clear and loud enough for everyone to hear, as she revealed that Julian Croft had actively falsified the pre-flight safety reports for the last 3 months, deliberately hiding the thermal shielding defects to protect his own corporate standing. Julian opened his mouth to lie, but the hard digital proof on the screen left him completely cornered, his career and his reputation completely unraveled in front of the single most powerful military procurement general in the country. General Vance turned his cold eyes to Julian, ordering his security detail to escort the disgraced chief engineer off the base immediately, before turning back to Caleb with a deep bow of his head, stating that the demonstration flight would proceed under Dr. Thornton's sole technical supervision. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything neither of them had said out loud yet, as the final piece of justice found its way back to the quiet airfield in Oak Ridge. The formal assembly, inside the grand conference room of Langford Aerospace's headquarters, was packed to absolute capacity on the following Monday morning, with the entire board of directors, the local airfield staff, and General Vance himself sitting in silent anticipation under the gleaming glass chandeliers. Victoria Langford stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her usual stiff corporate power suit replaced by a simple, elegant dark dress, her posture erect, but her expression completely stripped of its old defensive arrogance. She looked directly at the assembly of investors and journalists, her voice unwavering and clear as she publicly chose truth and accountability over her own pride, openly admitting that her company had almost committed a catastrophic error due to blind corporate greed and misplaced trust in superficial credentials. She officially announced the immediate termination of Julian Croft, and went on to present a full, unredacted history of the X700's development, formally restoring Caleb Thornton's name to every single patent and blueprint from which it had been erased years before. Victoria then turned toward the back of the room where Caleb was sitting quietly beside Harper, and with a deep, emotional sincerity, she offered him the position of Chief Technology Officer of Langford Aerospace, complete with a massive multi-million-dollar compensation package and a seat on the executive board. Caleb stood up from his chair, holding Harper's hand as he walked down the center aisle, his face completely devoid of any gloating or desire for revenge, his characteristic calm composure commanding the absolute respect of every person in the room. He looked at Victoria, acknowledging her courage in standing before her board to admit her faults, but he quietly and firmly declined the showy, high-pressure corporate title, stating that a life of constant travel and late-night executive meetings would take him away from the only job that truly mattered to him, being a father to his daughter. Instead of the wealth and the prestige, Caleb asked for a systemic, meaningful change, requesting that Langford Aerospace establish a permanent, fully funded regional experimental research center right there at the Oak Ridge Airfield. He asked to be named the local director of experimental maintenance, a role that would allow him to design advanced safety systems with absolute autonomy, while ensuring he would never have to miss a single dinner or school play with Harper. Victoria accepted his counter-proposal with tears glinting in her eyes, realizing that this man possessed a level of true worth and integrity that no amount of corporate money could ever buy, and the board immediately voted to approve the new arrangement with a unanimous show of hands. 6 months would pass before the final, quiet dust would settle over the transformation that had taken place in both of their lives. It was a beautiful golden Saturday afternoon at the Oak Ridge Airfield, and the harsh, high-pressure chaos of the military contract had long since faded into a productive, peaceful routine. The massive, sleek prototype was gone, replaced by a row of advanced commercial safety transport planes that Caleb's new local team was modifying with advanced fly-by-wire redundancy loops. Victoria Langford walked into the quiet hangar, no longer wearing her corporate high heels or carrying an anxious expression, instead dressed in a comfortable knitted sweater and a pair of simple boots. She sat down on a wooden crate near the workbench, watching with a soft, genuine smile as 8-year-old Harper carefully used a small paintbrush to add bright blue stripes to a wooden model airplane Caleb had built for her. Caleb stood beside them, wiping his grease-stained hands with a clean rag, the air around them filled with the familiar, comforting scent of aviation fuel and warm summer wind. Victoria looked out at the runway, admitting quietly that she had spent her entire life running after numbers, contracts, and empty status, never realizing that the most beautiful, valuable things in this world don't fly at Mach 2 or sit in a corner office. Harper ran over and handed Victoria a colorful drawing of the three of them standing beside a small plane, and as Victoria pressed the drawing against her heart, her old, guarded corporate exterior completely melted away, replaced by a warm sense of belonging she had never known before. Caleb looked at her and softly noted that true worth isn't something you prove to a board of directors. It's something you build quietly every single day for the people you love. So many of you watching have lived this exact same story in your own lives, working silently in the shadows while being underestimated, passed over, or completely misjudged by people who only looked at your title or the stains on your clothes. But just like Caleb's weathered canvas backpack, true brilliance and unmatched character don't need a polished corporate label to change the world when the real storm finally arrives. Has someone in your own life ever been misjudged the way Caleb was, written off and dismissed before anyone bothered to really see who they were and what they were capable of? Tell us about them in the comments below, even if it's just to finally give them the credit and the validation they always deserved. If you believe that the quiet, overlooked people of this world deserve to be seen and celebrated for their true value, we invite you to subscribe and stay a part of our family here, where the deepest truths are always revealed in the quietest moments.